one last time, macroeconomic equilibrium. Savings equals investment. But how does it happen? Remember this famous equation. It came from the uses of your income and spending equals income, and voila, we've got the sum total of all savings in the economy is what's available for businesses to borrow if they want to build new factories, install equipment, and do other investment spending. And the thing that makes saving equal to investment is the adjustment of the interest rate, because the interest rate is the price of money, and we're talking here about financial markets, people saving, people borrowing. And this financial market, this investment spending, this interest rate story is the link between the financial system, money, interest-bearing assets, and the real economy, all of the spending that people do. So let's look at how this happens. Let's start with a diagram that we've drawn before. Here's the demand for loanable funds. This is businesses wanting to borrow money. And businesses want to borrow more money whenever the real interest rate is lower. And they want to borrow less money when the real interest rate is higher. That's because investment projects are profitable when you can borrow money at low rates. And investment projects are less profitable when you have to pay most of your profits to the bank. That is when the interest rate is high. Now, the other side of the story is the behavior of savers, that is the supply of loanable funds, and that's the blue curve. And it's upward sloping because households are willing to forego their consumption and put more of their income into savings whenever the reward for savings is higher. And if inflation is constant, you get a bigger real return on your savings when the nominal interest rate is higher. Now, we've already talked about this nominal interest rate, real interest rate problem. Everybody really cares about the real interest rate because the real interest rate is what determines the return on your project in the terms you care about, your purchasing power. So if the inflation rate is constant, we can talk about the nominal interest rate because the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate move one for one in the same direction when the inflation rate is held constant. So, for the moment, hold inflation constant and look at the behavior of businesses and the behavior of savers. And now we're ready to talk about equilibrium. Suppose we have an interest rate way down here. Suppose we call this interest rate 1. Maybe it's 5%. Well, at a very low interest rate, businesses are really eager to borrow money because a lot of investment projects are profitable if you can get the money at a low rate. On the other hand, if you look at the blue curve, people are not very interested in saving money whenever the return is so low. Therefore, there's an excess demand for loanable funds. Lots of businesses want to borrow, very few households want to save. So with this excess demand, businesses start competing aggressively to get money. They're willing to pay a higher interest rate. And whenever they pay this higher interest rate, then people are willing to save more money because the reward is higher. So the equilibrium interest rate is established as businesses bid higher and higher and higher interest rates to get funds. And whenever the businesses bid higher interest rates, some businesses decide to drop out of the bidding. They can't afford to pay those higher interest rates and still make a profit on their investment projects. So as the interest rate is bid up, we move along the red demand curve. That is, the quantity of loanable funds demanded shrinks. Over here, as the interest rate is bid up, households want to supply more loanable funds because the return is higher. Eventually, we reach a point to where an interest rate is established where the quantity of loanable funds demanded is equal to the quantity of loanable funds supplied. And we can call that, in this case, R0. This is the equilibrium interest rate in this market. The equilibrium interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds demanded equals the quantity of loanable funds supplied. But look, the people supplying the funds are savers. The people borrowing the funds are businesses doing investment. So at this point where the blue and the red curves cross in equilibrium, savings equals investment. The adjustment of the interest rate helped us establish macroeconomic equilibrium. You get the same story if you start at an interest rate that's too high. If the interest rate I1 were way up here, then you'd have everybody wanting to save and fewer businesses wanting to borrow, an excess supply of loanable funds. So what would happen in this case is that savers would have to accept a lower interest rate if they wanted to get any kind of return on their money. So savers would start to bid against one another, agreeing to accept a lower interest rate rather than doing without any return at all. So then what happens is that as the interest rate falls, with savers being willing to accept a lower rate, more businesses want to borrow money. The interest rate continues to fall because of this excess supply of loanable funds until finally we return to the point at which savings equals investment. We're back at the equilibrium where the red curve and the blue curve cross. An interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds demanded is equal to the quantity of loanable funds supplied. So there you have it, the usual story. Excess demand is eliminated by prices going up. Excess supply is eliminated by prices going down. The bidding mechanism establishes the equilibrium interest rate. The next step is to look at what would happen to the equilibrium interest rate if there were a change in the environment. That is, suppose something happens that causes either businesses to change their behavior at any given interest rate, or savers to change their behavior at any given interest rate. That is, a shift in one of the curves. Let's start with the demand side. Suppose now that the government gives businesses tax incentives to install new equipment. That is, some kind of government incentive to increase investment, like happened in President Reagan's administration in the early 1980s. Businesses were allowed to write off their investment expenditures faster through accelerated depreciation, and they got tax credits when they made new investments. The intent of this policy was to stimulate the economy, and indeed what happened was that businesses found it profitable to borrow more money so that they could install more equipment and build new factories. So the government incentives resulted in an increase in the demand for loanable funds. That is, businesses wanted to borrow more money at any given interest rate. So at the original interest rate now, what have we got? We're still on the blue curve because savers haven't changed their behavior. But now we've got this new red curve out here, so we've got excess demand. Businesses want to borrow a lot more money at this interest rate than savers want to save. So what happens? The bidding mechanism kicks in and interest rates begin to rise. Interest rates keep rising until we reach this new point of intersection between the new demand curve and the original supply curve. And that means after this accelerated depreciation, after these tax incentives to increase investment spending, what we get is a higher equilibrium interest rate and a larger quantity of investment spending. The financial markets expand as businesses try to borrow more money to take advantage of the opportunity created by favorable tax treatment of investment spending. Well, there you have it. Anything that shifts the demand curve out is going to push up the interest rate and cause financial activity to increase. Let's consider a possible change on the other side now. Suppose that the U.S. government decides to run a bigger deficit. So there's a bigger federal government budget deficit. In that case, what happens is the government now is saving less. And when the government saves less, then the total savings in the economy shrinks at any given interest rate. So with a decrease in government savings, total savings decreases, and the savings curve, the supply curve of loanable funds, shifts inward. Well, what's going to be the consequence? The consequence is, at the original interest rate, the quantity of loanable funds supplied is less than the quantity of loanable funds demanded on our original red demand curve. So, once again, we've got excess demand. And with excess demand, interest rates will be bid up. This time, however, the total amount of financial activity is going to be shrinking in the market. And what we get in equilibrium is I1, a smaller amount of overall investment and a higher interest rate. This is what we call in macroeconomics crowding out. When the government comes into the financial system and borrows more money because it's running a bigger deficit, it crowds out business spending. It pushes up the interest rate, leaving less of the funds that are available for the business. When the government borrows more, there's less of the savings in the economy that's available for businesses to build factories with. Crowding out. An increase in the government budget deficit leads to a higher equilibrium interest rate and a lower overall amount of investment spending. So, any story you tell now, you can represent by a shift in either the demand curve for loanable funds or the supply curve for loanable funds. And whatever story you have, by shifting the curves appropriately, you can predict what will happen to the interest rate and the overall amount of business spending. Anyway, whatever the story, the economy adjusts, the interest rate adjusts until macroeconomic equilibrium is reestablished. And you know what that means. Savings equals investment.